Hi, folks. Welcome to this latest webinar in our series here at GW Law School in our Government Procurement Law program. This summer series, we've been doing summer series over the last few years. This summer series is focused on green procurement issues across borders. We're going to have 3 different sessions. When those of you who've registered, you've registered effectively for all 3. The 3 sessions are today, and then on Thursday, and then next Tuesday as well. We have 3 different sessions, all of them held at the same time. I'll be talking more about scheduling issues in just a second. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'm Chris Eukins. I'm the Lynn David Research Professor in Government Procurement Law at George Washington University Law School in the Government Procurement Law program. I just want to let you know there's a couple of administrative things. The recording and the materials for this program will be on the program page of publicprocurementinternational.com. And we're also going to be putting the recording on the GW Law Government Procurement Law Program YouTube page. That'll be later today. For sure, the publicprocurementinternational.com will have the recording. We'll be having Q&A during the session, and we also hope to have chat as well. Please feel free to chime in if you have questions. We're going to be using this format throughout the 3 sessions. Just want to say up front that any speaker statements made are in their personal capacity, because some of the speakers that we have are advocates, and we have to make clear that their statements are in their personal capacity. We have, actually, I recounted it. We have over 300 folks registered from 63 countries around the world. We're very, very glad that we can have such an international audience participating today. This map is up on the program page if you're curious. And one of the neat things that's happened over the years that we've done these webinars, we started on the pandemic, is more and more people have been able to join us internationally. It's really helped knit together the international procurement community. So as I said, today is the first session, and then on Thursday, there'll be another hour-long session where we'll be discussing trade issues with Rob Anderson and Tom Daly. We'll be discussing, in that session, we'll be discussing some of the nuances that green public procurement raise in terms of trade. As a threshold matter, it looks like green public procurement raises trade barriers, and Abby will be talking about that a little bit today. But in fact, there are some solutions, and we'll be talking about that on Thursday, on July 25th. And then next Tuesday, a week from today, we're going to be talking about state and local issues. Green procurement is an emerging issue across the United States here, and we'll be talking about how some state and local governments are addressing that. State and local governments here in the United States typically don't have the same resources that federal agencies have for procurement. So what you'll be able to see, for those of you who are outside the United States, what you'll be able to see is how smaller governments at the state and local level are still implementing successful green procurement solutions here across the United States. And again, each of these sessions is going to be at the same time. It's at 9 a.m. Pacific on our West Coast here in the United States, 12 noon Eastern, where I am on the East Coast, and 1800 Central European time. So today, Abby Semple from Greenville Procurement Partners is going to be discussing developments in the United Kingdom and the European Union. I'll be giving you a deeper introduction in just a second. Jellie Molino at the University of Cambridge, she's a postdoctoral fellow there. She'll discuss international institutions' approaches to green public procurement. And then I'm going to be stepping in for Esky. She's from the Sapiens Network, and she prepared slides, which are included. The slides, by the way, are linked at the program page in Public Procurement International. Those slides are available. Her slides are available, but I've hidden them here from the presentation because she's called away to Turkey, and I'm going to go ahead and fill in for her with it, just a couple slides of my own, and then we'll have discussions. I hope during the discussion period that we can discuss audience questions. So please feel free to put questions that you have up in the chat. So Abby Semple is going to be our first speaker. She's a public procurement consultant with many years of international experience. She's managed complex tenders on behalf of public sector clients in Ireland and the UK. She's worked on the development of procurement law guidance and policy in the EU and in Germany, really across Europe and in the United States. She holds a PhD from the University of London, a law degree from Trinity College Dublin, and a postgraduate qualification in public procurement from the Institute of Public Administration. And you're going to see this in her presentation. Just one. Her areas of expertise include the EU procurement directives, green and socially responsible procurement, life cycle costing, framework agreements, contract design, and e-procurement. She's developed criteria, tender documents, guidance, and training materials on behalf of a number of authorities at local, national, and the international level, including the Irish Environmental Protection Agency, the European Commission, and the U.S. Department of Energy. She writes and speaks frequently on procurement topics throughout Europe and the world. She's a member of the Procurement Lawyers Association and the University Association for Contemporary European Studies. And as I think you'll see from the discussion, as we're walking through, for example, when I talk about compliance issues and about enforcement issues, having practical experience, Abby's type of practical experience is vitally important as we sort through the legal and systemic solutions for problems that we can see arising in this area. Next is Jellie Molino. Dr. Molino is an international legal expert on sustainable public procurement with experience working for international organizations across the UN, the World Bank, the Multilateral Development Banks. She's a member of the Philippine Bar with specialization in administrative law, environmental law, and corporate compliance. She holds a PhD in law and institutions from the University of Turin in Italy. She has an LLM from our program at GW. She was my student, and a wonderful, wonderful person to have. And an executive MBA from the Asian Institute of Management, and a JD from the University of Batangas, and a BA degree in philosophy from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Hughes Hall Center for Climate Change Engagement, with research focusing on private law, procurement, and climate change. She also serves as, She also serves as procurement advisor for UNOPS, an international sustainable public procurement expert for the World Bank in Bangladesh. Thank you, and welcome very much to our two guests. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby. And Abby, if it's okay with you, I'll just advance your slides.
Yep, perfect. Thanks for that, Chris, and thanks very much for the introduction. Great to be here today, and I'm going to do my best to give you a concise overview of the situation in terms of green public procurement in the EU and UK. So I am based in London, but very much working with European clients, both in Ireland and other parts of Europe, and also working in the UK with public bodies here. So next slide, please. Right, so just to give a bit of context here, so green public procurement, more commonly probably now referred to as sustainable public procurement, is not at all a new phenomenon in Europe. So we have, going back to sort of the mid to late 90s, a number of public bodies starting to take this on board. And I would say in particular, and I think this chimes with something Chris said in his introduction, it did tend to be led by local government rather than being central government authorities who were the first to embrace green or sustainable procurement. You also sometimes hear the term responsible procurement. And I suppose the distinction here is that when in Europe we talk about sustainable or responsible procurement, that tends to include the social aspects, so the supply chain, things like human labour rights, also things like gender equality, accessibility for people with disabilities, etc. So that tends to be incorporated when we use the term sustainable procurement or responsible procurement, whereas obviously green public procurement tends to focus exclusively on the environmental side. And just for a bit of history there, the European Commission for a long time really only embraced the environmental side and saw the social side as potentially being more of a threat to open competition or fair competition for public contracts. That changed about 10 or 12 years ago now, more or less around the time of the 2014 directives being adopted. The European Commission is now fully behind, I would say, the social aspects of public procurement as well as the environmental aspects. Next bullet point, please. Actually, you might just advance all the bullet points, Chris, and then I can go through them. Thank you. Sorry. So we have, as I mentioned, had some developments. So we had notably the 2014 procurement directives adopted, which really cemented the possibility of including environmental and social criteria in tenders. That already existed to some extent before then. However, there were a number of cases where it had come under challenge. And almost universally in those cases, the European Court had come back and said, no, there is scope for including environmental and social criteria in tenders. And it had done some work to sort of define how that can take place. So in 2014, what we really saw was a codification of some of the case law that had developed up to that point. And the general trend, I would say, from the throughout this century has been that both in the legislation and in the case law, we have been seeing, an increasing not just tolerance, but I suppose welcoming for the use of environmental and social criteria. And that has reflected, the drive that has come obviously very, very strongly from the European Commission in more recent years in order to address, in particular, environmental issues through the way public money is spent. And it's been a bottom up process, but also a top down process, and we are seeing that really becoming a mainstream phenomenon within the past 10 years or so. However, there is another trend to be aware of, and this was very much highlighted by a report from the European Court of Auditors, which came out towards the end of last year. And that is that we do have a problem in many European countries with low levels of competition for public contracts. In some European countries, you have as many as 50% of contracts being awarded with a single bidder, and or being awarded by use of direct awards, so where there is no competition held. And keep in mind, these are only contracts which are valued above the European threshold. So these are higher value contracts. Now, it's not always the case that you have more competition for higher value contracts. In fact, sometimes it can be the opposite, that you actually see a more competitive procurement environment for your lower value contracts in some jurisdictions. However, nonetheless, there is concern that levels of competition have been declining in many parts of Europe, and also that we see increased use of direct awards in some cases. And I mentioned that just because, obviously, for those of you who follow European politics, we have just re-elected Ursula von der Leyen as the head of the next Commission. And it's just to give a bit of context to the fact that we may be looking at another reform of the procurement directives. And one of the issues which I think many policymakers would want to address are these low levels of competition. Now, I'd be really interested, if we have time in the discussion later, for people's views on the interaction between green or sustainable procurement and levels of competition. Do we see, for example, green criteria as being something which encourages more competition, or is it something that has a negative effect on competition? These, to my mind, are questions to which we don't really have good, solid answers in terms of the research that's out there. But it is an issue which is on many policymakers' minds, I believe. The other trend to be aware of is that we have a very large volume of new EU environmental and social regulation. I'm going to highlight some of that in a moment. And what that means is that some of the traditional focus, so some of the things we used to focus on quite a lot within green procurement, so things like supply chain transparency or certification of suppliers, a lot of that is now actually required under general legislation, which applies to industry as a whole. So what that means is that you can see that as it's in some ways a success of green procurement, that we've actually driven some of these requirements, and they're now being adopted as mainstream general requirements. And it also potentially opens up the possibility of new areas of focus for green and social procurement, and indeed the connection between those two areas. So one of the areas I've been doing some work on in Ireland and elsewhere is the whole idea of a just transition. So how do we make sure that as we are moving to a green economy, that we are helping people to reskill, so that the people who used to install gas boilers, for example, can now install heat pumps and other similar changes in other sectors. And that is an area where we are seeing some innovation and increasing focus as part of green procurement. Next bullet point, please. There's one more on this slide. Yeah, so this is the point about strategic industries. So this will actually be highlighted on the next slide as well. So we do have some concerns in Europe that as we have embraced things such as renewable energy, that we have also created an increasing dependency on jurisdictions. And I would say the greatest concern relates to dependency on China and Chinese businesses in terms of things like electric vehicle batteries or other technologies that we are depending on in terms of the green transition. And if we go to the next slide, actually, we can see that highlighted in comments from Ursula von der Leyen, and this is in her sort of the statement in terms of the political priorities for the next European Commission. And here she has said quite plainly that she's going to propose a revision of the Public Procurement Directive. And somewhat surprisingly, I would say, for anyone who's familiar with the history and general direction of European procurement regulation, she's saying that this will enable preference to be given to European products for certain strategic sectors. So this is very much giving voice to the concern that as part of the green transition, we may be, engaging in, we may have developed a dependency on other jurisdictions, and obviously in Europe we want to have our own homegrown industries. I think this is also a nod to things such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA and the way that's been used in some cases to support your own domestic industry in terms of developing green technologies. And she's also mentioning security of supply, which is obviously a concern in a challenging geopolitical environment such as we're in at the moment. And then finally, and this I have to say, I think evokes a bit of a wry smile for anyone who's been following European public procurement for some time, that she wants to modernise and simplify our public procurement rules. Well, we did attempt to do that the last time round, and I think it was universally acknowledged to be a failure in terms of simplification. And the problem that we encountered at that time, and which we may well encounter again, is that where you try and create more flexibility in your regulation so that people have more choice and perhaps more freedom in terms of how they award contracts, inevitably you also increase complexity, okay? Because by definition, your legislation has to cover a number of different scenarios. Okay, so that's an indication of the political direction that's set out over the next, that will be in place for the next 5 years or so. Next slide, please. Yeah, and if you want to maybe just, load all the bullet points on the next slide, that'd be great, Chris. So this slide just highlights some of the legislation which has been adopted, and this is really only over the past year or so. So the final year or the final 18 months of the current European Commission. And you can see here, some of this may be familiar to you, but we have a range of legislation really targeting primarily environmental considerations, but also in some cases social considerations throughout supply chains. Okay, and the interesting feature of the legislation highlighted here is that most of it directly refers to the role of public procurement and sets specific requirements in the context of public procurement. So we are seeing a lot of legislation identifying public procurement as being a really important tool in order to address the environmental impact of these various sectors. And each of these pieces of legislation takes a different approach to that. So I'm hoping that in maybe 5 to 10 years, we'll have a really interesting source of comparative research in terms of, what actually works, or what is the impact of different legislative approaches when we're trying to use public procurement as a tool, to support a transition within the economy. Because some of them, set sort of minimum requirements. So in terms of what you have to buy, some of them set more procedural requirements. So saying things like, you must take this into account. So a variety of different approaches being taken, as you can see, across a number of different sectors. Next slide, please. Okay, just go back for a minute. So I just wanted to, by way of comparison, have a look at the UK. And as everyone knows, the UK is no longer part of the European Union. And as part of that, has started the process of amending some of the legislation which governs areas which were hitherto governed by legislation derived from European law. And procurement is one of those areas. So we've had over the last 3 or 4 years now, the gestation of a new UK Procurement Act, which was adopted in October of last year and comes into effect October of this year. And this has been quite an interesting process because there were a lot of demands in terms of this legislation. So there are a lot of people who said, "Oh, you look, we want to do things differently. We don't like all this legislation that's been, inherited from Europe, and let's start fresh. Let's do things differently." And industry and business also put forward their views quite strongly. And as part of the Brexit campaign, things such as red tape, this dreaded idea of red tape. We're going to get rid of the red tape. We're going to tear it off. We're going to make it, everything much simpler. Um, from my point of view, again, as with the European reform, I wouldn't say that the UK Procurement Act reflects a radical simplification of procurement law. One indication of that is that we now have 13 different forms of notice that have to be dealt with by contracting authorities. So in some cases, perhaps an increase in the level of bureaucracy. However, we can say that it takes a somewhat different approach. And if you just go on to the next slide, Chris, I'll just highlight a few areas where changes have been made. So we do have a reduction in the number of procedures. So under the European directives, we actually have, depending on how you classify them, either 6 or 7 different procedures that can be used. Whereas now in the UK, we will have just 2 different procedures that we can use. However, that said, the competitive flexible procedure is kind of like a choose your own adventure procedure, right? So what that means is that the contracting authority, whilst it has to abide by certain sort of light touch rules, they can essentially choose how to organize the competition. So that does obviously increase flexibility and choice. Doesn't really create simplification from the point of view of bidders, because obviously it means that that you may encounter very different types of requirement or procedure and have to get your head around those each time you set out to tender. So again, we see this sort of classic trade-off between flexibility and simplicity. I mentioned the number of notices. Also some changes which to me really look a bit more cosmetic in nature, and I'm not the only one who would make that observation. So changing, for example, from the most economically advantageous tender to the most advantageous tender in terms of the award basis. We may not see that much changing in practice related to that, but it really remains to be seen how the courts will go about interpreting that change. We do have, obviously, because the UK is no longer in the EU, we no longer have references to the treaty principles, so things such as equal treatment, transparency, non-discrimination, etc. However, these have essentially been replaced by the procurement objectives, which again, whilst the language is somewhat different, seem to me very similar in substance to what we had under the treaty principles. And then we also have this additional layer of the National Procurement Policy Statement. And this is one where those of you who follow British politics will know we have a new Labour government elected very recently. So it is possible that they will seek to introduce a new national procurement policy statement in order to outline their priorities in terms of public procurement, because obviously the previous government had published its. And the current version that we have in place, I would say, is very minimal in terms of references to environmental aspects. They sort of get a sort of passing mention, but there isn't much that really pushes that, I would say, as part of the National Procurement Policy Statement. I think there's one more bullet point on this slide, please. Oops, if you want to just go back for a moment. Yeah, so sorry, the light touch regime. So this is where it gets somewhat interesting because, again, with the UK being outside of the EU, it does conceivably have more choice and flexibility. And one of the areas where it has exploited this under the new legislation is under what's called the light touch regime. So this relates to services which are not covered by the UK's commitments under the WTO Government Procurement Agreement, and accordingly, they have, there's much less in the way of requirements on contracting authorities. So, in terms of the time limits that apply to tenders, in terms of things like the rules on modifications to contracts after award, we are seeing what I would say is genuinely a lighter touch system for these services. So that will be an interesting one to watch to see whether that leads to different approaches in terms of green procurement. Again, it would be amazing if we could see whether that leads to more or less competition for these types of services. One of the objectives here is to make it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as voluntary and community sector enterprises to bid for some of these contracts. And that's an area where many local authorities have focused their efforts in recent years. So I think what we're hopefully going to get is a really interesting source of comparison between what's happening in the UK, what's happening in the EU. Both, in both jurisdictions, we have a lot of examples of successful approaches to green procurement as well as social procurement. And hopefully, this isn't sort of the end of the relationship. We're hopeful of having good relations between the UK and the EU, and lots of room for interesting cross-fertilization in areas such as green public procurement. So I think that's it from my side, just to give a bird's eye view, but obviously happy to take any questions after the other speakers.
And we've been accumulating questions from the chat as you've spoken, Abby. So we have questions for our discussion, but a quick question for you on competitive flexible procedure. So open procedure for the Americans online, open procedure would be our sealed bidding, roughly analogous to our sealed bidding. And then competitive flexible procedure could encompass a lot of different things. From an American perspective, when we've talked about this over the last decade or so, our working assumption has been that something like our competitive negotiations, or what would be called a competitive dialogue or competitive procedure with negotiation under the EU directives. That's the best way to go if you're trying to use procurement to leverage sustainability across the economy, because if you make sustainability an award criterion in the technical evaluation, then essentially you're leveraging, you're forcing the market to present more green goods and services. So competitive dialogue seems to us the best way to go down the road in terms of being able to use the procurement system to get to a more sustainable future. Do you think, is that the European perspective as well?
Well, what I would say is that it's not a one size fits all. So and this is absolutely, there are areas where the use of what we would call award criteria, as a way of sort of expressing a preference or rewarding enhanced levels of performance under environmental criteria. That is certainly an area that has been used very effectively in many contracts in order to encourage good green bids. It's not the only approach that we see being used. We also see the use of technical specifications or technical requirements. And when I'm, thinking with clients about, which approach to use, it really comes down to the level of market knowledge that they have going into the process. So if they know the market quite well, then they might feel comfortable setting, technical specifications, so minimum requirement in relation to environmental performance, because they know that at least, a fair segment of the market will be able to respond to that. If they don't have that knowledge, then I would generally recommend that they go down the award criteria route, because that way they can see where the market is and they can then allocate the marks accordingly. So it is, I suppose, horses for courses, as we might say. But yeah, I mean, both of those approaches still possible in the UK and used in the EU for different types of contract, I would say.
Thanks very much, Abby. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jellie.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor. So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, wherever you might be. I saw some colleagues in the chat already from different countries. But first, allow me to take this opportunity again to thank Professor Chris, my mentor, my supervisor, for this opportunity to be part of this discussion. But before I start, it's a protocol for me to introduce the college where I am currently connected, which is the Usual College here at the University of Cambridge. It is actually the oldest graduate college here. It was established in 1885, and we are now accepting postgraduate students and mature students in all areas of study and research. And actually, that particular picture that you are seeing on the top is our iconic building which is called the Margaret William Building in honor of our 7th principal. And then the logo below is the Center for Climate Engagement, where I am affiliated as a senior fellow, and it was set up by the college in 2018 as a bridge initiative. So the college, we're producing much of research, but we don't just produce research. We have to make sure that our research will really solve problems, such as in the center, we're very focused on climate change. Anyhow, as mentioned by Professor Chris, what I will be sharing to you would be my personal assessment. Nonetheless, these were based on previous works where I had the privilege to be a part of. Hence, I could say that I have personal knowledge and the completion of some of the studies that I will be presenting. Next slide, sir, Professor, Professor Chris. So the topic that was assigned to me is focus on the international organizations approach to green procurement. But I would like to start first by showing these particular figures, which are actually taken from the 2022 Sustainable Public Procurement Global Review of UNEP, where I work as one of the researchers and authors of the 4 chapters, including the specific chapter on the current state of sustainable public procurement and emerging trends. The assessment on this chapter was basically based on a stakeholder survey covering a total of 322 stakeholders from across the globe, and they are coming from international organizations, public authorities, companies, nonprofits, consultants who were actually involved in sustainable procurement. And one of the questions that we asked was their recommendations on how international organizations can support sustainable procurement. And the first graph that you can see on top actually indicates the response of our stakeholders, indicating that international organizations should focus on engaging the market, meaning that encouraging suppliers to make more sustainable products. And this is followed by providing tools to support sustainable procurement implementation, and of course, encouraging harmonization and standardization. We also tried to compare the result of the assessment in 2017 Sustainable Public Procurement Global Review, which is on the figure below it. And you can see that there has been a shift from the previous assessment was focused on building the case for sustainable procurement and measuring and communication of its benefits as the key areas that need support. But as you can see, it has changed into moving on supporting the market. And in fact, we also tried to see if these particular expectations from international organizations are the same across different regions. And if you can see on the bullets inside this blue portion, you'll see that it varies from the region. Of course, if you are coming from North America and even in European, where of course sustainable procurement or green procurement is considered as matured in terms of the practice, their expectation is really focused on market engagement and of course in terms of tools development. But if you will go on the cases of respondents coming from Asia Pacific, Latin America, the focus really is on training and capacity building. So in fact, as we are talking as of this moment, where I work as consultant for several projects of international organizations, we're really focused on raising awareness and capacity building for purposes of developing policy framework that would support green procurement. Next slide, please. So in the subsequent slide, I will be showing to you the result of the assessment on sustainable procurement in the international intergovernmental organizations. Of course, if you look at the whole report, there is a particular chapter that is very specific on the role of intergovernmental organization, that is chapter 7. So unlike the two previous Sustainable Public Procurement Global Review of UNEP, where this particular chapter was not included, for this version of the 2022, there is a specific chapter on the role of international organization in promoting SP. So this is what I will be highlighting in the next 3 slides. So if you will look on this particular figure, you'll see that over the last 2 decades, there is a growing strong commitment to move sustainable public procurement agenda forward, both in the regional and international level. So if you will see that from the 2013 to 2017 global review, this has been already addressed. In fact, if you will look at the case of international organizations such as UNEP, historically, it was one of the international organizations that lead SPP in the global level, starting, of course, in 2005, you can see in this figure, by participating in a global initiative which is known as the MACA Restores for Sustainable Public Procurement, and this actually helped develop the SPP framework. And then eventually, UNEP developed the SPP approach, which was piloted in several countries. And it actually led to the publication of the first SPP guidelines in 2012. And then it was applied to several countries again. And of course, we were able to collect lessons and best practices, which leads to the publication of the 2021 SPP guidelines. And if you look in the case of OECD countries, you'll notice here that the first initiative from OECD insofar as the use of green public procurement was through the OECD recommendations on public procurement, which of course provide the recommendation on the use of public procurement as a secondary objective, such as for sustainable green growth. And then, of course, immediately after, the European Commission released the handbook. And then, of course, there are several communications providing practical guidance on the implementation of the GPP. So this is how international organizations have started insofar as promoting, at that time, green procurement, very focused on the green initiative. And next slide, please. And this particular slide, we check what are the different activities that these international organizations have actually done in supporting the SPP implementation. So between 2016 and 2021, there are several initiatives that are very focused on capacity building and policy making support. If you will look at this particular slide, this actually summarizes the different types of these initiatives. So it actually depends on the prioritization of the intergovernmental organization. So if you look in the case of the European Commission, very focused on supporting the needs of its member countries. So that's why you'll see that a great majority of its support is really focused on practical guidance, criteria, tools, capacity building to implement sustainable procurement in their member countries. Whereas if you look in the case of UNEP, the support really is global level. So at the time we were assessing the support of UNEP, for example, is focusing really on monitoring. The purpose is you have to gather data so that you see the gaps of the practices of the different countries, so that intervention will be provided according to the gaps. And at the same time, one of the initiatives that UNEP had, which was not actually available because they are already regional organizations or very focused on their member countries, is developing regional networks. So UNEP has been very active on developing regional networks so that there will be an opportunity to exchange best practices among the members in a particular region. And in the case, of course, of OECD, again, the same also, very focused on the use of the maps for purposes of assessing member and non-member countries. And then, of course, just recently, we know that OECD has also established the supplemental module for SPP assessment, which we also use when we are doing country assessment of the status of sustainable procurement in different countries. Next slide, please. And of course, this is something that is really very close to my heart, the role of multilateral development banks. In fact, this was the coverage of my PhD thesis. It's because prior to my graduate study in sustainable public procurement, I worked as legal and procurement specialist at the Office of General Counsel at Asian Development Bank. But prior to that, I was an environmental lawyer in my country, in the Philippines. And at the same time, I work as an administrative lawyer. So in that case, you'll see that when I was working with ADB, although I was just checking the draft of the standard bidding documents for ADB funded projects, I was actually checking the environmental impact assessment of the projects and then seeing like, how do we integrate the result of this environmental impact assessment in the standard bidding document, not as a contract clause, because at that time, what we are doing is just, integrate contract clauses, make sure that you follow the recommendations of the incorporated in the environmental impact assessment. But at the end of the day, when you look at countries that wherein these projects will be implemented, we know that there is issues or challenges on contract implementation. So I was thinking like, how can we protect the environment, support the people, even before the contract is awarded. At the time, it was 2015. I didn't even know what sustainable public procurement was. That's why I took this particular program and study. So this is why I am very focused on the role of MDBs, because by experience, I know that MDBs can influence their borrowing countries in the implementation of their development projects. And these are the different roles by which MDBs are actually performing. As of developmental financial institutions, we know that the role is to provide financial assistance, but at the same time, when you provide financial assistance, you have to make sure that these grants or loans conform with center standards of the bank. And then, of course, the bank also is considered as a policymaker, specifically in providing fundamental institutional and policy reforms, by providing also the same technical assistance and issuer of standards. So these are the basic role of the MDBs. And in fact, by this particular role, MDBs can actually influence the implementation of sustainable public procurement in their member countries. But of course, we check for purposes on the figure that was really very focused on assessing the policies of multilateral development banks in terms of sustainable public procurement in their project procurement. And if you will see in this particular slide, you'll notice that, of course, although this has been updated because the data is as old as 2021. So some of the banks have already developed SP policies. And of course, they also have come up with SP priorities in their procurement regulations. They also have SP guidance and SP target. For example, on the time that we're doing the assessment, only Inter-American Development Bank has a very specific targets of making sure that a certain percentage of their contract will have representative from social criteria, so very focused on social criteria. But right now, as we are talking, as early as the last quarter of 2023, World Bank, for example, it has this target that all projects funded by the World Bank should use weighted criteria. And of course, we from the procurement know that if weighted criteria is something obligatory, there is a possibility of assessing the evaluation of the award, not just based on the price, but the technical specifications, quality, and other standards that could support green procurement. So this is how MDBs, for example, are leveraging on their roles to promote sustainable or green procurement. And the next slide, please. So because I've seen so many questions, so it will be good if we will have more time for discussion. But moving forward, you see, So what can we do more? There has been, we monitor a lot of what international organizations have been doing, specifically when we did this monitoring exercise when I was working for UNEP. But at the end of the day, we realized national organizations are buyer themselves. You see, so if I will just look on one particular international organization, for example, on moving forward, what do we expect international organizations to do more just by the UN agencies? So there are three issues that I've seen insofar as the practice is concerned. The first issue is that initiatives are currently fragmented to the point that there are possibility that there is duplication of efforts. So even if it is already a UN agency, you realize that sometimes there are efforts from one UN agency that is being duplicated by other UN agency. In fact, what we can do is increase collaboration so that there will be more opportunity to make sure that there is no redundancy. Actually, I had experience implementing that particular collaborations, which really works very well. That was in 2022, when I was commissioned by the IFC to support the country of Vietnam, because at the time, there is an urgent need to check and review the draft of the procurement regulation, because there is an ongoing process to amend. And from their assessment, there is one thing of provisions on green procurement. So I was commissioned to draft it, but considering that we are given, I think, 30 days, because the draft will be forwarded to the National Assembly. So it has to be a work of different international organizations. So although I'm the technical drafter, the UNDP supported by providing their literature, UN Women supported by providing all their data, the World Bank supported by providing all data, and of course, the private sector, international communities supported. So all of their data were given to me. And then of course, we deliberated until such time that within the period, we were able to support the country in making sure that the basic provisions on green procurement will be stipulated on the draft that will be forwarded to the National Assembly for deliberation. So you'll see, if there is a collaboration among international organizations, then there is a better impact to support countries, developing countries more particularly. And the second issues that I would like to raise here is, of course, the expectation for them to walk the talk. I just run this particular checking on the UNGM. So UNGM is like the platform where UN agencies are publishing their tenders. And you'll see that there is a specific portion there where you can see all the sustainable tenders. So I just run what are the procurement opportunities last year from January to December, because I was asked to report. And I've noticed that out of 1,400 tenders published, there were only 19. So only 14%. So it's like saying, why is it that there is a very low sustainable tenders from the tenders that are being published by UN agencies in their procurement platform? So the recommendation is that, UN should be the champion in promoting sustainable tenders. And then of course, here is also another issue, is that there are several UN agencies, although this has been addressed as we are talking, there are several UN agencies in a particular country. So, but not all of them are actually leveraging on the possibility of a framework or aggregating their demands for purposes of establishing a sustainable tender. So imagine if all of these UN agencies in a particular country and even a particular region will consolidate their needs and then publish a joint and collaborative procurement that will support SPP, then of course it will better enhance the buy-in of the market that there is really a high demand for sustainable procurement. So I will stop from here so that we can have more time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Shelley. We'll have a couple questions. I think we'll go a little bit over. Let's say we'll go about 10 minutes over for the discussion. I just very quickly want to go through these questions of contract administration, and because they create interesting questions regarding enforcement and contract administration. So the starting point for understanding the problem is the principal agent. This is a 1970s era economic theory that we use a lot in public procurement. And it says, in essence, that the contracting officials act as agents for a principal. And the principal is kind of inchoate, but it's probably everybody in the nation. The problem, the key enforcement problem here is that the global warming is an externality that not everybody in the nation agrees with. In my own country, for example, there are a lot of people who don't believe here that global warming actually exists. They think that the warming of the earth is just part of a cyclical change in Earth's temperature. They don't think greenhouse gases are to be blamed. They're a minority, but they're an important minority. So not all contracting officials may take to heart the idea of green procurement, because solving this problem, this global problem, is an externality for contracting. Even if they believe in global warming, they may say, look, my mission is to buy a very good gun. I don't care about what impact they may have on the environment more broadly. They may be very narrowly focused. So how to deal with contract compliance and with contract administration, those issues are issues that are more complex in this field, and we have to start thinking about ancillary solutions. Now, historically, what we've dealt with, when we've dealt with this issue in more traditional corruption issues, we have an optimal outcome, which is the contracting official buys the optimal car, which is the environmentally friendly car, and doesn't buy the purple car. It doesn't deviate from the optimal outcome. Instead, buys that environmentally sound car. And the ways that we can do that is by monitoring or by sanctioning. We can monitor and sanction the contracting official if she doesn't do what she's supposed to, and we can also monitor and sanction the vendor itself as a way of making sure that we have this optimal outcome. To understand how this plays out, we have to understand what are the different ways that we will reach green procurement, sustainable procurement. And these are the 5 basic methods that we've been identifying. We've been talking about in various programs, including a webinar we had on a joint EU-US catalog. And that joint catalog really demonstrates, and that's a webinar that's available on Public Procurement International. That EU catalog really demonstrates that these 5 approaches that Abby and Jellie have been talking about are 5 very common approaches internationally, using planning, looking at contractor qualification, using eco-labels, technical evaluations, life cycle costs. These are 5 very common approaches. So the question is, how do we deal then with the enforcement and the compliance issues of on these 5 different issues? And that question is one that really we have to go back to the fact that the contracting officials and others in the procurement process may be indifferent to the green procurement outcome. So we have to think about more holistically, how do we set up systems to make sure that these issues are being addressed? So, for example, with regards to contractor qualification, if we're going to disqualify contractors that aren't presenting green goods and services, we may have to have a debarment system that is more open, certainly than the one we have in the United States. The exclusion system in Europe is still evolving. Abby talked about the possibility there might be a new directive. Hopefully that exclusion system gets tightened in the European Union and, importantly, creates easier means of exchanging information across borders as a way of excluding contractors that aren't in fact presenting goods and services that are sustainable. So we begin to see that if we move to contractor to compliance and to enforcement, if we're going to make green procurement work, we have to think holistically. For each of these strategies, we have to think collaterally. On the fraud solution, for example, in the United States, you cannot bring a fraud action for something that the contracting officer, generally speaking, something the contracting officer didn't consider important to payment and performance. If the contracting officer isn't monitoring green procurement, it's going to be very hard for a third-party whistleblower or the government to bring a fraud action. So we have to start thinking about how do we ensure in shaping these green procurements that the door is open to a potential fraud enforcement by a third party or by an enforcement agency if in fact the green procurement is failing. So what I wanted to lay out here was as a first step to start thinking about how these green procurement strategies lead to a broader question of how do we set up the surrounding procurement system? How do we set up the compliance structures, the contract administration structures to make sure that in fact they are being met? Okay, with that, we have questions and discussions. And so the lead question that, and I had promised one of our audience members is I was going to put to Abby. Abby, the MEAT versus MAT, that transition in the UK, how is that going to affect green procurement?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I just want to apologize because I had responded to some of the questions in the chat, but I made that stupid error of not replying to everyone. So sorry, I'm trying to repost my replies, but apologies that I didn't do it in a timely way. Regarding the shift from meat to mat, personally, I wouldn't really see it as a paradigm shift. I would see it as more of a terminology shift. But it will be interesting to see if the courts really attach any significance to it. Now, if you look at the Procurement Act, the UK Procurement Act, many of the requirements for award criteria are still the same. So, in Europe, for example, we have a requirement that award criteria must be linked to the subject matter. In the UK now, they will have a requirement that award criteria must relate to the subject matter of the contract. So, and I'm sure there are clever lawyers participating in this. You might be able to argue for a difference between those two, but to me, it's not going to represent a major shift. That said, there is an interesting point to note, which is that under the UK Procurement Act, there is no longer a requirement that you take costs into account as part of your award criteria, whereas that has always been a requirement under European law. You can't exclude cost completely from the evaluation of a tender. So potentially that does leave room, for contracts, sort of fixed price type contracts, or where the contracting authority states a particular budget, and they don't then actually have to analyze costs on a competitive basis. And now you might, and obviously you could have some interesting arguments about whether that's something we want to be doing with public funds. But there are some changes there, but I would be surprised if we see, a major reorientation of award criteria as a result of the adoption of the UK Procurement Act.
Thanks very much, Abby. One of the other questions, and this is for both of you, one of the questions we had was whether or not move to green procurement raises new risks of corruption. What do you two think?
On my case, before embarking in sustainable public procurement, I was very focused on fighting corruption in procurement in the Philippines. So it's like from a corruption lawyer to a sustainable public procurement advocate. And I've realized it's the other way around, because sustainable public procurement requires transparency, and it might prevent, the possibility of a fly-by-night contractors that are sometimes, chosen by certain not so good politicians, because you have to establish the performance of suppliers, you have to establish the performance of contractors. So for my case, it's the other way around, that sustainable public procurement, in fact, that's what I'm trying to tell myself. It's a cute way of saying I'm actually fighting corruption in developing countries by advocating sustainability, because it requires transparency, it requires responsibility, both from the buyer and the supplier.
That's really interesting, Jellie. And I think we've worked in, I suppose, different jurisdictions, but I would really echo what you've said. I've worked in countries such as Ukraine and other Central and Eastern European countries where they have a long-standing concern about corruption in procurement, as should we all really. It's not limited to any one jurisdiction. It's certainly alive and well in countries such as the UK, as well, as we saw recently during the pandemic. But I think the idea that green procurement somehow gives cover for corruption, there really isn't very much evidence around that. And if there, to the extent that we do have evidence, it tends to point in the other direction, that by making people, or even encouraging people, to think more carefully about what it is that they're buying, and also to justify their decisions, you are actually contributing to transparency in procurement, and well motivated and well thought out public spending decisions. Decision based on lowest price alone is absolutely not a bulwark against corruption, as we've seen time and again. You can award to the lowest bidder, and that contract never gets delivered, or gets delivered in a way which is deeply flawed. So that approach, I think, has been pretty discredited in the fight against corruption. But green procurement does offer us some other approaches which can be effective in that fight.
And I think that, as I was discussing before, because of the externality problems, because the procurement system itself may not sufficiently enforce these green procurement goals, transparency becomes, as Jellie's pointed out, transparency becomes absolutely essential, because then the third parties can start speaking to the failure in green procurement. But basically, Jellie, that's what you've done in your studies, that your empirical studies, is proven the need for that kind of outside transparency. I remember the struggle we had when you were a student, and we were trying to figure out how you would access the United Nations solicitations, because it's so important for you to be able to do empirical study. When those things aren't transparent, it's impossible to assess. Okay, so just a quick note on terms of the before we move on to the last set of questions is what Abby raised a question regarding the Inflation Reduction Act. Abby, what the irony is the Inflation Reduction Act in Europe has been very controversial and it's been reviled. But in fact, the real evil is in the Build America, Buy America Act. The Biden administration put a very strong domestic preference in infrastructure, about an $80 billion infrastructure, infrastructure appropriation mechanism. Bottom line is that under the Build America, Buy America Act, even if European providers, for example, have access to an American American project that is funded with federal dollars, they will not be able to enjoy the GPA. The GPA will not give, and we'll talk about this on Thursday. They still have to seek a waiver through the federal government. So it's actually BABA that's creating the huge procurement problems, not necessarily the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act has just been the focus of political anger in Europe. Okay, just I have a question for you, Abby, in terms of, you were talking about a holistic approach where you deal with social issues, with issues of economic sustainability and environmental sustainability, green procurement, all as a package. And you pointed out quite appropriately that the term that's more commonly used is environmental sustainability, package of all three. In the states, at the federal level, Abby, the tendency has been to break them off from each other, to focus on environmental sustainability separately. One of the reasons Carrie is joining us is because on next week from Portland is Carrie Waters is the head of the Green Procurement Initiative in Portland, and Portland is an exception. Portland deals with them holistically across all three. That's one of the reasons we wanted to have her join us. But Abby, in Europe, in the European experience, is there a political risk to having all three together, so that those who oppose these efforts can shoot at whatever is the weakest target because they're a bundle altogether? Should put it differently, should developing nations be dealing with them as separate issues, or should they be dealing with them as a bundle? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. I guess I can't. From the political perspective, I think you're probably right. If we address them as a package, there is the possibility that the next government or administration that comes in sees things differently and says, no, we can't have any of that stuff. And it all gets cancelled. I would say that they do sometimes merit slightly different approaches, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't address them in the same policy or the same legislation. It simply means that when you look carefully at what you're trying to do with social procurement, and again, social procurement encompasses many things. It encompasses supply chain considerations, but also it encompasses the outcome of public contracts and the impacts that they're having on communities, for example. And in the UK, we talk a lot about things such as community benefits, for example, whereas I know in other jurisdictions, it's more about, okay, well, who is actually providing that contract and how do we ensure that we're getting a representation, from different groups. So Again, depending on what the specific objective is, the approach is probably going to vary. In terms of making it politically, bulletproof, I'm not sure we can, but I think, it's really about showing the results of this, and showing that, this is a legitimate way to spend public funds, and to demonstrate that, we are having an impact. And, the way governments used to think about it, if you go back, in the US as far back as the New Deal, public works contracts were seen as making work for people. And okay, so you're actually taking people off the unemployment register, by employing them on a public works contract. So the concept isn't new, and it might not have universal public support, but when you look at how we spend public funds, there's often quite a clear argument to be made for it.
Good. Jellie, did you have any comments?
In my experience, of course, what I have been focusing on is really supporting developing countries with respect to initiative on green procurement, and one thing I've noticed is that compared to the cases mentioned by Abby, in countries like, for example, Bangladesh, and recently I worked in Angola, this discussion on in issues of sustainable public procurement is that they think they didn't know what it is, but when you go there, I was in Bangladesh just 3 weeks ago. I had stakeholder engagement with several government agencies. They shared me their practices. In fact, I was telling them, your practices are even more advanced than European countries because you already have mandatory criteria in your technical specifications. But you didn't know that in your technical specifications, that is mandatory criteria. So in all your government projects, you have green procurement, but they didn't know it. They didn't know. So I think the idea is really, there is an important, support that we have to give to countries that are thinking they are not doing sustainable procurement, they're not doing green procurement, by just talking to them, learning from what their experience, and telling them, you're not as underdeveloped as European countries, and you can do it. You just have to make them understand that your little baby steps are in fact already big steps, and we need to support them. So different approach. In Angola, I did a diagnostic assessment, and in that case, there was a question in the chat saying that, why is that GPP is not mentioned on environmental protection law? Well, that was the case many years ago. But right now, if you look at environmental protection law, more particularly in climate change, procurement is being mentioned there. So what was happening many years ago is not the case as of this moment. But the idea is that we really have to make sure that the discussion is continuing, and then we have to make sure that our reach will be as high as those countries that they think they are very low in terms of, and their confidence level is very low. But in fact, when you go there, they're even more advanced, as in the case of some countries where I had an opportunity also to evaluate.
I think you both answered my last question, but let me walk through it with you. So in the U.S., we have we'll talk about this more on Thursday, but we have a proposed rule that's pending that's been stalled from the Biden administration that would, in a nutshell, say that major contractors can be disqualified if they don't chronicle their greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea is that you force them, in order to be responsible or qualified, they have to have the greenhouse gas data. And the concern with that has been that, in essence, it's like a blind man shooting into a crowd, because you don't really know which vendors might fail ahead of time. So you don't know what impact that can have on your supply chain. And that's stalled largely because a conservative Congress opposed it. It stalled at least until next administration, whatever happens in the November elections. The other approach that has become a final rule is what I would call an eco-label approach, where agencies are encouraged to the maximum extent practical to actually consider eco labels and build them into the technical standards. And so that approach, the eco label approach, is moving forward, and the other approach, which is based on contractor qualification, is really stalled. I think what I'm hearing you say, based on your practical experience, is the U.S. is replicating an international experience, that internationally we're seeing eco labels used successfully in nations at all stages of development, but a more radical approach, like a disqualification approach, is less common. Is that a fair generalization?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with that. I think it's yeah, fair enough statement. Sorry, I was just answering another question there in the chat.
In the countries where I've evaluated, disqualification is the least of the approached. Most probably the reason is that the the platform, the dynamics on how to disqualify is not as matured as other countries. And then the second is, of course, the limitation of market players. So I think, as much as they would like to disqualify, the sometimes it becomes a personal action of the procuring official, not necessarily the entity. And of course, you're working in a community where suppliers are more or less, you are within the same community, you see them in the market, So in that case, that is the list, the list. That's why, because of the particular dynamics in the environment, we're really looking on the approach of, the qualification criteria should be strengthened, rather than, it's like more on the carrot approach rather than the stick, because we know that it may not work on a certain level, specifically if you're working on small island. I was working with Guyana and some projects with ITCILO. And if you realize, if you're working in small island, you know everyone, suppliers. So how would you do that in that case?
Alrighty. I think we'll wrap up there, and thank you both very much for a very interesting program. As I said, the video recording will be available later today on Public Procurement International. Thanks again. Always nice to see you both. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.